Take a look at the controller closest to you, specifically the left side. Does it remind you of any controllers that came before it? Odds are, probably not. Unless of course it's a PlayStation controller. Because whether you go all the way back to the PS1 or even the PSP, you'll see the same exact thing. A D-pad design that has gone virtually untouched for decades. There is a particular reason for this, and we're going to look at the evolution of this iconic input to figure out why Sony might have had the perfect D-pad from the very beginning. While a lot of companies experimented with D-pad designs, trying to find the perfect feel for gamers, nobody has really settled on what works best for such from Sony. They may have just decided that this is part of their brand identity, or they may have decided that this was the best, most functional way a D-pad could be used. But this story doesn't begin with Sony. There was actually about 15 years separating the introduction of the D-pad and the release of the PS1. It had tons of time to grow and develop into the perfect product the PlayStation still has to this day. So what exactly did this initially look like? Well, way back in 1979, the Microvision games actually introduced the D-pad, specifically on two games. The first one I want to talk about is Sea Duel, mainly because it is the most unorthodox D-pad anyone has ever seen. They did incorporate the traditional up, down, left, and right buttons, but rather than being on each respective side of their input, they were placed in the four corners of a box. Up was top left, right was top right, down was bottom right, and left was bottom left. I assume this was done because there wasn't much space to be used for controls on these games and they needed two separate D-pads for this game, but it was still fairly odd nonetheless. And I assume this because there was another Microvision game that had a more straightforward and practical D-pad, which was Cosmic Hunter. This is the very first normal D-pad in gaming history, and as you can see, it's not exactly a perfect design. The arrows are fairly spaced out, which makes it a little awkward to use compared to the ones we have today, and there's an additional button in the middle of it, which I think could be an interesting addition to our current controllers. Although it was the first one, it was by no means perfect, but it did lay the groundwork for future consoles. A few years later, Nintendo entered the picture with the Donkey Kong Game & Watch, the second major system to feature a D-pad. This was widely successful, making the most revenue for Nintendo than any other Game & Watch game. Not much later on, the concept of a D-pad carried over into lots of other consoles, but none more notable than the original Game Boy. This had the simple cross-directional design that has been carried over through every generation of Game Boy and DS ever since. Now at this point, you may be thinking, with the success of all the handheld devices and its unchanged D-pad, why doesn't Nintendo get the credit for mastering the D-pad over Sony? And we'll get into that in a little bit because first we need to take a look at Nintendo's consoles. We can go back as far as 1983 here, where Nintendo releases the Famicom. For this console's controller, they had the typical D-pad that we all know and love, with divots in the form of arrows on each end of the cross. This was also the same for the NES. The SNES controllers, however, carried over the same design, but were less bulky than its predecessor, making minor improvements to it. It also carried over into the Nintendo 64 controllers, but most opinions online are that the SNES D-pad was much better in terms of quality and use. Then Nintendo really changed things up, making the tiniest D-pad on the GameCube controller that most people did not like. Next was the Wii controller, which was essentially the same size as the GameCube controller's D-pad, but was much more usable given the design of the controller and its easier clickability. The Wii U essentially kept the same D-pad, but then something interesting happened. With the release of the Switch, Nintendo suddenly broke up the D-pad into 4 different buttons. Does that remind you of anything? This wasn't just a one-off either. Sure, they introduced the Switch Lite and gave it their typical handheld D-pad like their Game Boys and DS's, but they doubled down on using 4 separate buttons with the release of the Switch 2. Nintendo may have finally realized that Sony figured out the best form of D-pad from day one, and tried their hand at the design themselves. And I don't think it's any coincidence that the Switch is Nintendo's best-selling console of all time. But what if I told you that this design wasn't exactly the product of Sony, but of Nintendo's all along? Remember that Donkey Kong Game & Watch that I mentioned earlier? Well, soon after the success of that, in classic Nintendo fashion, they filed a patent in 1985 on the multi-directional switch, specifically meaning the cross-design of the D-pad that the game used. This patent was granted for up to 20 years and expired in 2005. This is the reason why you saw so many different designs and controllers, from the weird round D-pads of the Sega and original Xbox, to the separated buttons on the PlayStation controllers. This is also why you didn't see a normal cross-designed D-pad on an Xbox controller until the Xbox One. Since the Xbox 360 was released in 2005 and would be playing with fire with the patent expiring that same year. Of course, they resorted back to their round D-pad once again in the newer generation, so who knows what they're thinking. But these initial designs weren't because these companies wanted to be different, it was because they had to be different. But now that the patent isn't a thing, look at the consoles now. Obviously we covered the big three already, but look at the other handheld consoles that are out there. For the most part, they're leaning more towards the Nintendo design than the Sony design, so who can really say which one is better? It may be all up to preference, but Sony and Nintendo have the sales numbers, so how do you really tell them apart? And even if you are looking at sales, Nintendo has the classic cross design on all their handheld devices, and pretty much all of those have sold like crazy. So at the end of the day, was Sony's consistent D-pad design a stroke of genius, or just a clever workaround to avoid Nintendo's patent? Maybe it's a bit of both. What's undeniable is that the PlayStation's take on the D-pad has stood the test of time. Even as the controllers continue to evolve, the simple 4-button cluster has been there virtually unchanged for over 30 years. And that begs the question, did Sony actually perfect the D-pad on day one, or has Nintendo been right all along? What do you think? Which D-pad do you think is the greatest of all time? Let me know down in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you on the next one.